some statistics that you have on the relationship between ADHD and burnout during lunchtime when I'm supposed to be doing these tests, daydreaming out the window. And I use binaural beats for concentration sometimes to literally put myself in a bubble.
Everybody who has had an ADHD diagnosis will be able to look back at school reports and will have comments such as...
I went through a phase when I was at work of not just doodling, but I was creating pictures for my daughter. Benefits of having an official diagnosis versus just carrying on and knowing that we've got some habits.
So for me personally, when I had my official diagnosis, I was 48. I uncovered this at 48 rather than...
Hey there, I'm Hannah Holden and welcome to the Burnout Isn't Necessary podcast. If you're experiencing stress or burnout, I want you to know two things. First off, you are not alone. And second, you're in the right place. This podcast is all about sharing real lived experiences of stress and burnout. It's also about giving you deeper insights into what's happening when we're stressed and burnout, like the biology of stress. And of course, giving you actionable takeaways that you can put into practice in your life so that you can begin to feel more like yourself again. I hope you love the podcast. And if you do, I'd be so grateful if you would subscribe and maybe even leave a review or a rating. This improves our chances of new listeners finding us. Thanks so much. Now let's dive in.
Episode, we are joined by Sarah Morgan. Sarah is a leadership and performance coach specialising in resilience and neurodiversity at work. She has certifications in executive coaching and ADHD coaching, as well as her 25 years of executive leadership experience. She helps leaders and teams build resilience, navigate workplace challenges and thrive. Sarah is passionate about creating psychologically safe environments where neurodivergent professionals can harness their strengths and succeed.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining me. I wanted to first of all welcome you. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here.
And to set the scene a little about how we got to be here. So Sarah and I were both giving talks for a wellbeing event recently online. And Sarah's talk was directly before mine. And I was just telling Sarah before we joined here that there was a part of me that was thinking, oh, I'm going to miss out on the menopause one. I was hoping that the menopause one was going to be before me. That would have been interesting. And I've kind of avoided the topic of ADHD, which is what we're going to be talking about today, thinking that it was completely irrelevant to the topics I'm interested in and to me personally, until your talk, where I sat there as you went through every bullet point, thinking, yeah, that's me. Oh, that's me. Yes, that's me. And then when you also talked about the connection between burnout and ADHD, some pennies were dropping in my mind. And so I thought if pennies are dropping in my mind, then no doubt they would be for listeners as well. So that's how we came to be here. And I thought that it would be useful to share some statistics that you have on the relationship between ADHD and burnout, because I feel like that also sets the scene as to the relationship between the two topics and why we're here today.
Yeah, absolutely. It was really shocking when I delved into the numbers. And there's a gent called Nick Dean who's doing some additional research at the moment for UK ADHDers, and also people with autism spectrum disorder and so on, but specifically ADHD burnout symptoms, according to ADDA in 2021, up to 93% of adults with ADHD experience burnout, as opposed to about 30% of the general population. And according to some research by Kawa, Pisula and Murta, also in 2021, the risk of burnout is over 50% higher for people with ADHD. So really quite stark stats there.
Yeah, and I also keep hearing about how many people are getting late diagnoses, and I see people posting online about, I'm in my 40s, I'm in my 50s, I've only just been diagnosed, or my grandchild's just been diagnosed, and now I'm beginning to realize that perhaps it was me too, and I can see it in my parents, and it's all in the family. So I think that that's also interesting, because I personally have experienced burnout, but hadn't made the connection, hadn't thought that ADHD was relevant to me until it all seemed to tick boxes. So let's then talk about what are the symptoms. So you were describing them in that presentation that you gave. It would be really helpful, I think, for listeners to get a better feel, because I had no idea, and there I was exhibiting pretty much all of them.
So I think we've grown up with this perception that ADHD is the naughty boy, 7 or 8 years old, running around, can't sit still, pulling stuff off shelves, generally being incredibly boisterous and out of control.
Mm-hmm.
And well, yes, there are aspects of hyperactive type ADHD that can present that way. There's a recognition now that ADHD presents either as hyperactivity and or as inattentiveness. So there's actually 3 different diagnosis paths. There's inattentive type, hyperactive type, and combined type. And women and girls particularly tend to display much more internalized hyperactivity, even if they are the hyperactive type or combined type. So that might be many, many tracks running in your brain all at the same time, rather than physically being hyperactive. The signs and symptoms are quite broad, and many people will experience some of them from time to time. But what pushes us into the ADHD space is when they are a lot of the time, and they're impacting your quality of life, or they're impacting your ability to live in a way that's not fettered by it. So it can be things like, distractibility. It can be things like the need to be moving and fidgeting, but also things that are very different, like temporal discounting. For an ADHD brain, there's things happen now or they're not now. So it can be really hard to plan things out in a way for somebody who is struggling with ADHD. The concept of what you can get done today, tomorrow, next week, the week after is much harder to visualize and manage with an ADHD brain.
So you called it temporal discounting.
Yes. So temporal discounting, it's kind of it's almost the minimizing of the passage of time. From a psychology perspective, it's about like discounting the passage of time, I guess. So temporal being time-based. So it's very much that something is now or it's not now. And the same then happens with another fundamental aspect called object permanence, where, again, for many people with ADHD, if they can't see something, it almost ceases to exist. A little bit like a toddler playing peekaboo, perhaps. But a lot of people who have ADHD are renowned for being quite messy. And for many years, so I'm one of the late diagnosed, for many years, I used to wonder why. I always knew exactly where everything was, but everything was always a dreadful mess. I couldn't put anything away. And if stuff did go away, I never knew where anything was. And then I realized it's this sense of object permanence that is lacking for an ADHD brain. So if you can see it and it's there, we need those visual stimuli. I know some of my clients in the ADHD space who really struggle with it, literally have lists on each cupboard door, each drawer front, to remind them what's in the cupboard and what's in the drawer, because it ceases to exist when it goes out of their visual, which is really interesting. One thing that we can really struggle with is task switching. And this shows up in 2 different ways for people with ADHD. Firstly, we can get absolutely hyper focused in a task to the point that time and space cease to exist. We are so focused on it, and it's a running joke almost within the ADHD community that we forget to eat, we forget to drink, we forget to go to the loo. And I'll be sat there, if I do some work after I've picked my daughter up from school, suddenly I'll realize it's 20:08, everyone's starving, I've done no dinner, everyone's wondering what on earth happened, because I've just got completely sucked into this hyper focus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Flip side of that is that we're more likely to get distracted with stuff that we're not interested in, that isn't urgent, that isn't something that we're passionate about in the moment. So the flip side of it is almost this pirouette syndrome, where we'll start to look at a little bit of everything and run around in circles doing the square root of nothing in particular, because we can't fix on one thing until again we hit that hyper focus.
Okay, so can I just I want to try and explore some of these so that we can kind of bring to life what they feel like. And so for me, I definitely recognize the hyper focus if I'm doing something. So historically, this would be how I would get if I was doing like textiles and crafting projects. I would disappear, like time would become irrelevant. I would disappear into this black hole for weekends, for entire weekends. And not bother showering, just like be in my creative project. So I recognize that, but I also recognize that if I'm trying to sit down and do something that is not exactly inspiring, it's a real challenge to drown out the noise of all the other things that are seeking my attention. And so I do find that in those times where I have to do that, a clear desk, nobody disturbing me, like I use binaural beats for concentration sometimes to literally like put myself in a bubble. So I consciously create a bubble to be able to use my hyper focus intentionally on something that I don't necessarily enjoy. Does that sound?
Yes, absolutely. And you saw the grin when you said binaural beats, because that is a very clear way for it works in terms of the neuroscience of an ADHD brain to quieten all of the additional tracks, because they're focused on the binaural beats so that you can use the part of your brain that you need to focus on focusing.
Mm-hmm.
So that it's the auditory equivalent of a fidget toy, I think.
Okay, I didn't realize I was into fidget toys, but there we go. Something that you mentioned earlier, and I don't know if this is what you meant, but when you were talking about there's the hyperactive, and then I can't remember what you described it, but it's the kind
inattentive. Inattentive, yeah.
My mum often quotes one of my school reports from when I was about 8 years old, where my teacher said, I have no idea how she comes to the answers in her maths. Like her workings out are completely random, but she always gets the right answer. I have a way of like picturing numbers, working with numbers, that I have my own way, and I've never learned my times tables. I can't learn my times tables. But he also said, if only she spent as much time present in the classroom as she does daydreaming out the window.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so. Yeah, I was known as a daydreamer. And then when I moved schools, they tried to get me to do these tests, and I couldn't bring my brain to focus on the tests. I would just sit there for an hour during lunchtime when I'm supposed to be doing these tests, daydreaming out the window. And the teacher was like, "We're getting nowhere." I'm sharing these because I want to try and bring it to life. And if these so that's where I kind of resonate and think what you're describing as this sort of theory, that's how it's showed up for me. And is what I'm describing typical of somebody who is ADHD?
Most definitely. I think virtually everybody who has had an ADHD diagnosis will be able to look back at school reports and will have comments such as, really intelligent but always looking out the window, would do really well if she could just concentrate, would do really well if she could just stop talking, would do really well if she could just sit still. They're the things. We have huge amounts of creativity and the ability to connect the dots, which can mean that we're very quick learners. However, keeping that focus in the right place can be really hard. And the flip side of it can be that as ADHD thinkers, we've got these 16 tracks all running at the same time. So sometimes I'll be looking out of the window, looking at something that's, I guess it's the visual equivalent of the binaural beat. It's something that's not really taking up any brain power, but is a distraction that's quietening some of the chatter, so I can focus on what's being said more easily.
Yeah.
it might be staring out of the window, it might be doodling. And in fact, I put a poll on LinkedIn today about meeting survival guides for ADHDers. And some people there were talking about the fact that they play really simple puzzle games on their phone when they're in a Zoom call, not because they're multitasking or bored, but because actually that quietens that chimp part of the brain, so that they can really focus on what's being said, which I thought was fascinating.
Yes, that really resonates with me. And you are so right. I seem to I know that there are times where I might look like I'm not focused, but actually I'm almost switching off my visual sense by staring into space at some clouds. And then it allows me to concentrate on what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
And I also know I'm a huge doodler. And I went through a phase when I was at work of not just doodling, but I was creating pictures for my daughter. So she had come home and I'd have coloured in this unicorn for like this rainbow coloured unicorn for her. And I would have spent the day just shading it, whilst actually it was allowing me to concentrate more on what was being said. And so, yeah, it may have looked to somebody else like I wasn't really paying attention, but actually this act of switching off some of my senses was really allowing me to zone in all the more on what was being said and be even more present.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. Yeah.
And I think it's then in the workplace, being able to have the self-awareness to understand what you're doing and why, the confidence and psychological safety to be able to explain that to your colleagues and your manager, and to ask for the adjustments and the allowance, whether that's that you think better on your feet, you think better when you're doodling, you think better when you're playing Candy Crush, but for people around you to then understand that you're not being rude by zoning out, you're being incredibly respectful actually by doing what enables you to truly focus.
Yes, I can imagine that many colleagues don't take kindly to somebody playing on their phone.
Absolutely. It's just sat in the board meeting playing Candy Crush.
Yeah, it really does. It really, I would perceive that as somebody not paying attention and not being, but I also recognize what you were saying about, so much of my time was spent in back-to-back meetings. And when they were back-to-back meetings where I was talking, especially one-to-one, where there wasn't an opportunity to turn off the screen or just not focus on the screen whilst listening, just be able to stare into space and not be focused on a screen so close to me, then I would find those days really draining. So it takes a lot of my concentration to be on screen and really engaging through the screen with somebody. So that's also, that also resonated with me. I can't remember all of the points you made. You went through a very comprehensive list on that session. And yeah, there was maybe just one point where I thought, no, that's not me.
The rest of them were like tick, tick, tick.
Yeah, they really were.
We talked about things like, oh, sorry, carry on.
Well, I was going to say, and what about in other people? So what kind of things might we notice in somebody else, whether that be an adult or a child?
It's really difficult. It might be, I think, in a work context, what we might notice are the things that are going to frustrate us in a colleague. So things like situational variability. So you've got a colleague who will do certain things incredibly well. They'll grab it with both hands, they'll run with it, they'll absolutely work their socks off. And you give them something else that they're slightly less interested in, they simply won't do it. They won't get started. They can't get started. They'll procrastinate. And that situational variability for that person is so tied in with the ADHD. If you're not interested, if it's not urgent, if it's not something you're passionate about, it's really hard to get it done. The other thing that many ADHDers do is we kind of ride there's a chemical in our brain called epinephrine, and it is released when we're running up towards a deadline. It's related to an adrenal response. And many ADHDers will almost unconsciously, obviously, but purposefully wait until the deadline or until they're close to the deadline, do that deadline dance, because then they get this surge of epinephrine, which really helps. It feels great. You can get stuff done. You kind of really get into that hyper focus and smash it out at the last minute. So again, as a colleague, that can be quite frustrating, because perhaps you wanted to work with somebody through it in the weeks in the run up to, maybe you feel really uncomfortable and really unhappy with somebody who's leaving it to the last minute, because that can be incredibly anxiety ridden for other people. But the ADHD is like, yes, I'm doing all the things right at the last minute and feeling great about it. So that's the sort of thing that you might see in your colleagues.
I can recognize that a little bit in myself, but also more recently was working with somebody who did exactly that with his part of a bigger project and left it to the last minute. And the frustration there was that there wasn't any opportunity for revisions for, and I whilst I'm sure, I always believe that by reviewing and sharing our work, we can make it so much better. Another perspective always adds value. And doing it at the 11th hour for me was frustrating, because we ended up having to submit something that nobody else had reviewed and there was no review time. So yeah, I can definitely see that one. Yeah. So is there a difference between epinephrine and adrenaline, or are they the same thing?
So I'm not a neuroscientist. I think that they are different. So there's noradrenaline and epinephrine. I think they're related but different.
Okay. But a similar sensation. If maybe they're very similar, maybe they're the same, maybe they're slightly different, but similar kind of experience, right? It's that adrenaline, feeling like you're on that adrenaline rush. So yes. That's definitely something that has come up for other people I've met who've experienced burnout, and certainly for me, that when I was in my 20s, I enjoyed a life of project management where pretty much everything I was doing was up against the wall in terms of timing and feeling like it was some kind of superpower. My adrenaline was some kind of superpower. And so I can recognize some of that behavior as well. Okay. And I also wanted to explore diagnosis. So, we've touched on the fact that so many people are now getting a diagnosis much later in life.
Yes.
And so I mean, we can use me as an example, or anybody listening. What are the benefits of having an official diagnosis versus just carrying on and knowing that we've got some habits?
That is a great question. So for me personally, when I had my official diagnosis, I was 48, and I was able to treat myself with so much more grace than prior to that point. So prior to understanding that I had ADHD and therefore these things were more difficult for me, I would, my inner critic was often front and foremost. I was lazy, I was rubbish, no one else found it this hard. I couldn't keep my focus on anything. All of my inner dialogue was incredibly critical. It was all my fault, and why was it so hard? And I shoulded myself all of the time. And with my diagnosis came two things, I think. One, the larger part of it, like I say, is the ability to be more forgiving, more understanding of myself, treat myself with a lot more grace. And also a little bit of grief that, I'd uncovered this at 48 rather than 8 or even 18. And therefore, swathes of my working life had been harder because I hadn't been able to give myself that grace and that understanding.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And have you experienced burnout or similar to burnout?
I have. And it's really interesting, as we were talking about the deadline dancing and the leaving everything to the last minute and the adrenaline. I think I worked in roles in technology delivery and operations that were very, very deadline driven and very adrenal in their being, instant management and so on. And I think I rode that wave for far too long. And through my mid-30s, I had a lot of illnesses, and I can look back now and see that I was absolutely burned out in many ways. And then when I was 43, I had a small child who wasn't sleeping very well, which definitely didn't help. But again, it was just absolutely pushing myself far too hard, using that adrenaline rush to get through things, hyper focus, overwork, a thing called rejection sensitive dysphoria, which we can talk about as well, which was really getting to me at the time in work. And I ended up in hospital with pneumonia and sepsis because I'd kept pushing myself so hard. And this feeling that if I could just press pause on the world and catch up, everything will be all right. And just running and running and running and running and using that hyper focus. And each time I'd bounce back, but a little bit less, until, 5-6 days in hospital, 5 nights, 6 days in hospital, desperately poorly. And I'm certainly not perfect now. I'll notice that how close I'll get at times to really emptying myself through running that hyper focus, but I'm better at recognizing it early enough to be able to take the rest when I need it.
Yeah, I think lots of people who I've spoken to who've experienced burnout then get concerned about, how can I trust myself to not do it again? How can I make sure that I'm never going to experience burnout again? And so, my alarm bells go now before I'm close to burnout, because I never want to be there ever again. It was horrible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you've mentioned a few. I was going to ask the question about, what do you think the underlying relationship is between, I mean, the statistics show us that there is clearly a relationship between ADHD and burnout. So to recap on what you were saying, up to 93% of adults with ADHD experience burnout. That's crazy. And that the risk of burnout is 50% higher for somebody with ADHD than the rest of the population. So there's clearly a relationship. And I think you've touched on some of, and perhaps you have answered the question as to what's the underlying, like, why is there that relationship. So let's explore that. I mean, you've said there's this ability to run on the knife edge with this adrenaline response, and using it to create that hyper focus and feeling like a superhero, which I recognize. So there's that. What else do you think there is?
So somebody who has ADHD will have been given, and I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but something like 24,000 more pieces of negative feedback by the age of 12 than a neurotypical child. So as an ADHDer, we're primed to be a disappointment. And therefore, we go into the workplace, with one hand tied behind our back, because we have undiagnosed ADHD. We don't know why things are as hard as they are and why it's easier for the neurotypicals. And because of all of the childhood messaging that we will have received, that's our fault. It's because we're not enough, or perhaps too much. So you put this desire to do well and to prove everyone wrong, or to people please, that's come from all of this negative messaging that we've had as children, alongside this ability that we have to be on fire. We're firing on all cylinders. It's all fabulous. With all of that expectation that we put on ourselves, and it creates a bonfire that burns us out.
Yeah, I can see that that's the perfect storm, because of course all of that messaging that we've received as children then becomes our internal dialogue, right? So we're constantly repeating that to ourselves of, oh, here's yet more evidence that you're not good enough. Here's yet more evidence that you can't concentrate like other people. Just constantly like having that internal conversation with yourself. And okay. And do you have ideas, tips, suggestions for how somebody who's resonating with everything that we're talking about might, are there tips and suggestions that might be able to help them manage themselves or manage the situations that they find themselves in?
Yeah, absolutely. So firstly, give yourself a hug, because it's been hard. It really, we're so, I'd love to do a piece of research around the inner critic and the critical voice for an ADHD versus somebody who isn't. So I think the first thing is, be more kind to ourselves. Give yourself a break. there is a perception that self-care is selfish, and there's this sense of overwhelm that we haven't touched on actually, where you have so many things to do that you're utterly overwhelmed by the size of the list, so you end up stuck. I heard somebody the other day refer to it as the ADHD sit. It's like, don't sit down, because you'll sit down and the overwhelm of all of the things that you have to do. So again, we're primed, therefore, to presume that we're lazy. We're not. We're overwhelmed. So be realistic about what you can do in a day. Be realistic and kind to yourself. Stopping and having 10 minutes for a cup of tea is absolutely self-care, and it's absolutely okay. Doing 1 or 2 things in a day and celebrating those things is huge. And I'm not a burnout expert as you are, but my assumption is there's some real similarities in what I'm saying for somebody who's coming to terms with the fact that they may have ADHD and somebody who's recognizing burnout. That be kind to yourself, take a break, don't pick off more than you can chew, take things one step at a time. If you've got 40 things on your to-do list, there is no way that you're going to get 40 things done. So be realistic.
And is that part of what you were talking about earlier, this temporal discounting? And is it like there's either now or there's never? And so is that why we have this thing of like, well, I've got 1,000 things on my to-do list and they all have to be done today and they all need my attention right now?
Absolutely.
And because if I'm saying it's not now, then I'm saying it doesn't matter and it never needs to happen. That's interesting. Yeah.
Or there's a perception that, well, there'll just be another 40 things tomorrow. So.
And that's where the overwhelm comes from, right? Where we believe that we've got this massive list. And I also, so thinking about how my brain works and how I've observed myself experience overwhelm, it's those 16 talk tracks, which are all running at the same time. And they're all throwing up like to-do lists. And I'm like, okay, I'm trying to catch them all. Right. Okay. Yeah, I need to do that. Yeah, I need to do that. Yeah, I need to do that. And yet when I actually go, okay, I'm going to try and get a hold of this overwhelm thing. And I did a whole episode on how I deal with overwhelm. And it's about like creating a mind map and actually writing it down and then being like, oh, it's actually manageable. And then starting to categorize, like, does it have to be done today? Does it? And then it's like, this isn't unmanageable. Thank you very much, brain, for like coming up with all the list. But actually, it's not that bad. If I don't repeat the list, just write it down once, it's a manageable list and it fits on a side of A4. So then, which it didn't feel like when I was just experiencing it. So the whole episode on that. But I think that's part of it. Like there's this multiple talk tracks running in my head, creating to-do lists for me to the point that whenever I start doing one thing, I've got more stuff being thrown at me by my brain saying, but you should be doing this, but you should be doing that. Don't forget this. What about the Sainsbury's order? Like, and so it's very easy to end up in overwhelm. Just it's very difficult to lose perspective on actually how much and what is important.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm a really strong fan or big fan of the Eisenhower matrix. I don't know if you've come across that, but you basically cut your to-do list into 4 quadrants. So there's urgent, not urgent, important, and not important. So you can look, this is the urgent, important stuff. That is, pick 3 of those things, get them done. Brilliant. You've got the stuff that's important, not urgent. Actually, that's the stuff that you want to be spending more time on. Maybe the things that you're more likely to hyper focus on because they're important to you, but there's not that sense of urgency. And being able to defer or even delete the stuff that's really neither urgent nor important. That can be incredibly helpful. As you say, you've got your list of 40 things, but once you write it all down, you realize that it's not as big as you thought. The other thing that can really help us as an ADHD brain is working out how you can access some dopamine for the tasks that are really unpleasant for you or very boring. And, for me, it's reconciling my accounts. absolutely detest it. So I'll do something before I need to do it that's going to give me a boost of dopamine. Generally, it's bouncing around some music, ranked up to, all the way up to 11 and bounce around the kitchen. What can also help is a concept called body doubling. I don't know if you've come across this, where you, and there are platforms like Flown where you can join and commit to what you're going to get done, and you do it in a Zoom room with a bunch of other people also doing their rubbish tasks that they don't want to get done. And my productivity is, 3, 4, 5x what it would be if I was just sat there by myself. There's something about somebody else being there also doing work that, even though they're strangers, even though I could say I was going to do something and go off and play Candy Crush, there's something about that external accountability that just works for an ADHD brain.
Yeah, I can see those being helpful tips. And whilst I haven't done that exactly, I haven't done the body doubling, but I am aware of sometimes making a commitment to somebody about something that I don't necessarily want to do. But as soon as I've made that commitment to the person that this time next week, I'm going to have had that done and we can talk about it then. By making the commitment, I push myself into, it becomes I push it onto the urgent list.
Yeah.
By creating a false deadline for myself and a commitment with somebody else. Yeah.
Exactly that. And those false deadlines, again, if you're aware that you tend to deadline dance and you're aware that that is a problem for your energy, for your adrenal response, for your risk of burnout, working with a peer or colleague at work to say, can we put some pretend deadlines, some false deadlines in where we're going to sit down and review way ahead of time, so that you've got the little bit of an impetus because you've made a commitment without it being the big deadline that's really going to potentially chew through that adrenaline response.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't actually want to leave it till it's truly on the urgent list because then, as we said, nobody gets a chance to review and you are going to be burning the midnight oil and not doing yourself any favors in the long run.
Yeah.
Okay. So I feel like that's kind of a really nice tour of the subject of ADHD. We've covered what it looks like and why it's so relevant to burnout. We've talked about tips. We've talked about symptoms. Was there anything else that you feel we should have covered today? What would you like? Is there anything else that you'd like listeners to know about ADHD before we wrap up?
Oh, 1,000 things, but we've not got time. I think what I would say is currently, certainly in the UK, and I think across the globe, there is a real struggle to get onto a waiting list and anywhere near the top of the waiting list to get a diagnosis. So there are private routes available, but obviously that comes with a relatively significant financial incentive or cost rather. So I'm strongly of the opinion that if you're genuinely thinking that it's a probability and you've done some genuine research following neuroscientists such as Russell Barkley or Edward Hallowell, self-diagnosis has to be valid right now. In Sheffield, for example, the rate that they're working through the waiting list, it would be 10,000 years to get to the top of the waiting list.
Not in this lifetime.
Exactly. Now, clearly, something's got to change. And, this isn't even that everybody's jumping on the bandwagon. We're still looking at about 4% of the population who are currently seeking a diagnosis, which is way below where we would expect that to be anyway. So, yes, be kind to yourself, do your research. Don't necessarily listen to Marie from number 22 with her lived experience, although that can be really useful. Do go look up some solid scientific backed. So Russell Barkley and Ed Hallowell both have great YouTube channels where they've got huge amounts of information. There's some brilliant books out there. But if having gone through that, you can see this was something that was real in childhood, it's something that's real in adulthood, that is valid. And your self-diagnosis, your self-recognized impacts are valid, and your employer should be prepared to have a conversation with you based on that. So be kind to yourself and advocate for yourself at work.
Yeah, I also, so for me personally, like, this isn't some, as I've said, this isn't something that I've explored previously. It hadn't even occurred to me until there you were listing them off, and I was like, tick, tick, tick.
Sorry.
I feel no. It's all self-awareness, I guess. Many of the things that you had described, I was aware of my behaviors, my habits, my traits, but I hadn't understood that they were all linked to ADHD. So that was the connection I hadn't made. But I think that just, even if somebody recognizes some of those symptoms, just having an awareness of what your traits are and exploring some suggestions and tips. We've talked about binaural beats as a way, and me physically clearing the desk as well. I mean, I won't tidy up necessarily. I'll just clear it all off the desk and dump it on the floor. But it's so visually, I have a clear space. Because otherwise, the post-it notes, the mess is going to distract me. So we've shared some things that I think that if a listener says, "Oh, I recognize that I find it hard to get into a focused situation. I know that I can be focused or even hyper focused," then you can take those suggestions. You can take the clearing of the desk, and you can take the binaural beats and see how it works for you. And I really think, we're all on I believe that when it comes to neurodiversity and so many things, that we're actually on a scale, and we're all on there somewhere. And some of us are falling off the end at one end, or some of us are, and some of us will be somewhere along that line. And we've got so many different dimensions that we're on these different scales for. But if we can just so I can see that there's a benefit of having a diagnosis, but I can also see that even if you don't have a diagnosis, if you recognize your traits, you recognize what works for you and what doesn't, and you're open to exploring some of the suggestions and tips that work for other people, then you can take that and run with it.
Absolutely. The scaffolding and support that you want to have around you that will help you be your best kind of doesn't matter what labels attached to why those things are in existence.
Just having the conversation of, I realize that it looks like I'm not listening because I'm doodling, but actually what I'm doing is I'm distracting. I'm switching off the distractions by doodling and drawing nonsense on my notebook. And so I apologize if it looks like I'm not listening, but actually what I'm doing is listening to you all the more. I'm actually hyper focused. And I think that if you were able to have that conversation with somebody and you demonstrate it, because you ask the most astute questions, and it's very clear that you've listened to everything when you summarize back to them, then then there are ways, I guess. And I think that these suggestions and tips that we've kind of meandered through in this conversation, I think would be really helpful. So thank you, Sarah. It's been really interesting. I think that I could probably carry on asking you 1,000 questions. Your mind is in 1,000 directions, so we could probably carry on, but I feel like we've done it justice for one podcast episode, and maybe there will be future conversations as well. But thanks so much.
Thank you, Hannah. Thanks for inviting me. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully it's been helpful.
I hope so too. Let's see what people say. Thank you.
Thanks.
If you're interested in finding more about Sarah's work and making contact with her, then you can find her on LinkedIn. You can also find her website and her email address in the show notes.
I hope you loved this episode. If you have questions, or you're looking for a safe space to continue having conversations about these topics, then I'd love it if you would come and join us in our free LinkedIn community. It's a space for real conversations, sharing of tools, tips and experiences, and also to hold live sessions where we get to talk to one another about how we navigate stress and burnout. There's a link in the show notes, or you can search on LinkedIn for Burnout Isn't Necessary, and you'll find us under groups. One final reminder, this podcast is for education and inspiration and is not a substitute for professional support. You take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time.